Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're in Game 10 of the 2016 World Chess Championship. So far, the last few games have been extremely exciting. Game number 8 is when Magnus Carlsen, actually playing the white pieces, lost to Sergei Karjakin. And then the last game, Sergei Karjakin, really strong game. Potentially could have found a victory in that game, but they did have a draw. So with 3 games remaining, Magnus Carlsen is going to be playing the white pieces in 2 of them, Game 10 and then Game 12. And expecting fireworks from him. He knows that he needs at least a victory to continue on to potentially tiebreakers on November 30th, which is actually his birthday. So he's got to try something different. Can't try the same openings that we've done before. So we'll go ahead and jump into game number 10. Magnus Carlsen starts out pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, and then knight to f6. So this is the Berlin defense from Sergei Karjakin. Something, as we've talked about many times before, Magnus Carlsen extremely familiar with. It's one of his favorite defenses against the Rai Lopez. And he tries a different variation. So we haven't seen this for a while from Magnus Carlsen. It's pawn to d3. And this is a variation that we actually saw back in Sochi when he was playing Vichy Anand a couple of years ago for the World Chess Championship. After bishop to c5, in that particular thing, we saw castle on the king side. He decides to change it up a little bit and play pawn to c3. So he's trying to take his opponent out of book theory very early on. If people always ask me what kind of differentiates a grandmaster from a high-level top player, and one of those is their understanding of opening theory. If there's a high-level game that's been played with a certain line, they've probably studied it and they're probably pretty familiar with it. So Magnus Carlsen's trying to get his opponent out of theory as fast as possible to make him start using up some of his time, because early on they don't use much time on some of these openings. So that's kind of what Magnus Carlsen recognizes he needs to do, because Karjakin's been playing extremely well on defense. So we see continue, castle on the king side, bishop to g5, getting the dark square bishop involved into the game. Pawn to h6, forcing the bishop back here to h4. Bishop comes back here to e7, just protecting this knight being pinned down. Castle on the king side, pawn to d6, just solidifying the pawn chain. So Karjakin, so far, doing a pretty good job of defending against this Berlin defense. Kind of an anti-Berlin attack from Magnus Carlsen here. Knight here to d2. Knight to h5, looking to come to the f4 square right here. And then the bishop decides to go ahead and take here. We do see an exchange. And then knight to c4. Now, this is kind of holding down this fort. Sometimes you'll even want to see pawn here to h3 to protect the bishop coming down here to g4. But instead says, okay, yeah, I could play pawn to h3, but that's not really going to stop this knight to f4, which is really what Karjakin wants to be doing. Then it's somewhat of a wasted move. You may not even see the bishop coming down here. Bishop may come to something like e6 to kind of stop any threat of this light square bishop attacking. Sometimes when you have your pawn structures on the dark squares from black, you do want to stop your opponent from really attacking this f7 square. So decides to go ahead and not worry about a pawn to h3 move, and instead go for more of a pawn to c4, and then bring it back over here to e3 potentially, or maybe start an attack on the queen side of the board. So Karjakin comes down, knight to f4, as we kind of thought we saw after knight here to h5, knight over here to e3, and then queen to f6, pawn to g3, forcing the knight to move, knight over here to h3, forcing the king to move, and then we see the knight come back here to e7. So Karjakin decides he's not really looking to trade off material right now. He wants to kind of maneuver his pieces over to the king side of the board, recognizing that he could potentially have a strong attack or just defend against Magnus Carlsen's attack that he has to assume is going to be coming in this game. Now, bishop to c4, and something I thought we might see from Magnus Carlsen. Anytime your opponent kind of takes their pieces away from some piece of the board that's very important. In the early game, it's usually going to be the center of the board. So you see this knight over here on h3, now protecting the center. You see the knight here was protecting it with knight here on c6. But as soon as he comes back here to e7, there's kind of an opening here. So I thought we may see pawn to d4, maybe start to attack the center of the board. And then maybe, e6, trying to just get light square bishop involved into the game. Pawn to d4, probably what we see here. Bishop back here, kind of wasting a move. Queen to e2, just completing development here. But you can see starting to choke off some of the squares that Karjakin can go to. Thought we might have seen it in the game. We did not. Instead, we saw the bishop come here to c4, starting to attack this long light square diagonal. Pawn to c6, getting ready to push forward if he needs to, try to control these light squares in the center of the board. Bishop back here to b3, knight to g6, queen to e2, completing development. Pawn to a5. And you see this a lot. As soon as one side plays, pawn to a4 or pawn to a5 from black, other side just immediately says, okay, I don't want you to put too much pressure on this side of the board. I don't want to have to worry about that. So pawn to a4, bishop to e6. Light square bishop's not doing too much on board right now. So decides, okay, there's a lot of pressure going on with your light square bishop. So let's just go ahead and trade that off so I don't have to worry about too much. Pawn recaptures on e6. This position, I actually like Karjakin's setup a little bit better. His knights aren't really playing together all that well currently. But the pawn structure right here from white does allow, a knight to eventually sneak in and attack. He does have, there's no pawns that have come off the board, but Karjakin does have a semi-open file for his rooks and his queens to start to really put pressure on this F file. Can get more involved into the game than Magnus Carlsen's rook over here on A1. So all in all, there's a lot of material that can still come off the board. We don't really know what the pawn structure is going to look like at the end game. So both sides have really strong chances. If I were just kind of judging this scenario right here, it does kind of look like Karjakin's did a good job defending and maybe has some really strong attacking chances. Now Magnus Carlsen plays knight to d2, and here's kind of a very critical spot in this particular game. And after this game, they had the press conference, and as we've talked about before, if you haven't seen these press conferences, they usually bring up different positions and just say, what were your thoughts on here? Did you consider this line? Did you think about this strategy? And one thing they really talked about Karjakin in this position is he kind of had a draw. Sergei Karjakin would snap high five his opponent if he could have a draw at this moment. Recognizing Magnus Carlsen, he needs a win. So if Karjakin can just defend and have a draw, especially the last two times that Karjakin has the black pieces, that would be a phenomenal result for him. And what they kind of asked him was, why didn't you go after knight to f2? And he was kind of going through some of the situations. He did not necessarily see that it was a forced draw. So knight to f2, we see king to g2, knight to h4, check. It gets a little tricky if the pawn were to take, because then you just have queen over here to g6. White's going to be down a pawn of material. The pawn structure is completely just destroyed over here on the king side for Magnus Carlsen. This would be bad, but let's say the pawn or the king comes back here to g1. Then pawn to h3, and then we do see a perpetual check here, and this would be a drawn game. Now, the situation that Karjakin said that he was looking at was the king to g1, and then after h3 check, king up here to g2, and he did not think about the fact that his knight could come to f4 and fork this queen here. Now, if the pawn were to take, the knight comes here, and there is going to be a fork. Now, even if the rook comes up and captures, that's going to be okay. Take that rook, have double rook and a queen. That's going to be an endgame that Karjakin should be able to go on and win. If nothing else, draw very, very easily. All in all, I don't think Magnus Carlsen would have allowed this position to happen. As everyone kind of said, if you would have played knight to f2, it probably just would have been a perpetual check. Karjakin said he did miss that in the game. He actually didn't think about it too long, which is kind of surprising. It was pawn to d5. So kind of the situation arose as we talked about on the opposite side, but once this knight was no longer defending the center of the board, Karjakin decided to go ahead and strike, try to have some exchange on board so he no longer has the double pawns here on the e file. But after queen to h5, knight comes back here to g5, so taking away some of that pressure. He could have, even if he wanted to, take it with his knight here on f2. Would have probably been some sort of repetition as well. King here to g2, queen up here to f7, getting ready for the knight to come down to f4 check, and a discovered attack on this queen as well. So I probably missed another forced draw as well. But knight comes back here to g5, taking away some of that pressure from Magnus Carlsen. Pawn up here h4. Now knight down here to f3. We could see an exchange on board, and that's exactly what we see. Queen comes down on f3 check. Queen decides to go ahead and take. Rook takes on f3. So all in all, this is pretty good, I think, for Karjakin, starting to exchange material on board. King to g2, forcing the rook back here to f7. Rook to e1. And this is interesting. In the game, Magnus Carlsen actually touched his pawn here on f2 before he moved. That was very slight, but it was very clear if you saw the video. He touched his pawn. If he would play pawn to f3, it still would have been okay. I don't think the position's all that terrible, but he actually did touch it. Now, they probably should have forced him to move the pawn, but it was so quick. Rook here to e1. They didn't really decide to make him change that. Pawn to h5. Knight back here to f1. Getting ready to maneuver that a little bit different. King to f8. Knight here to d2. King to e7. So now that the queens are off the board, and there's only one minor piece, you can really start to use your king involved into the game and have that be a major player for your attack on the board. Magnus Carlsen plays rook to e2. King up here to d6. Knight f3. Just saying, hey, I can have a nice little outpost here on g5. Depending on where you go, eventually I can take this pawn here on e5 since it's not being protected by any pawns right now, just material. Depending on where you go, could have that on board. Knight to g5 first, nice little outpost move. Rook over here to e1, rook to e8. Knight back here to f3. So both sides just moving a little bit, seeing what's going to happen here. And then knight to h8. And this kind of always has my spidey senses going off a little bit. Once someone's knight goes completely away from where the action is, I feel like there's going to be something crazy happens in the board. Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and start pushing in the center of the board. No reason to start, posturing around here with your other pieces. This knight's not involved. Okay, let's start to push. So pawn to d4. We do see an exchange of board. And that was actually the first pawns that have come off the board, which is kind of crazy. We're 35 moves in. That's the first time we see pawns coming off the board. Pawn here to g6, and then rook up here to e3. Getting ready to come to f3, and then up here to f6. Nice little square. You're attacking this e6 square that you have protection from your knight. You're also attacking this pawn right here. The knight on h8 does not want to stay on h8 protecting this pawn. So nice little combination Magnus Carlsen's looking to do, and he wants to keep Karjakin on his back foot. He wants him continue to defend. There's a lot of game left, and so he just wants to make sure that he is the aggressor and is putting pressure on his opponent. Knight to f7, pawn up here to e5 check, forces the king to come back. Rook here to f3, as we talked about. Knight to h6. So Karjakin doing a good job of maneuvering the knight out of trouble there, although he has used quite a bit of moves for this knight. Rook up here to f6. We kind of talked about this earlier. Rook to g7, protecting his pawn here on g6. Pawn up here to b4. We do see an exchange on board. Knight here to g8. Rook back here to f3. Recognizing, okay, right now at least, Karjakin has all his material just holding down these pawns, so can't really do anything. So decides to go ahead and focus over here on the queen side of the board. Knight to h6, pawn up here to a4. So starts to see a little bit of weakness. Says, okay, if your rooks and your knight are over here, I can start to maneuver over to the queen side and start to really put a lot of pressure on that side very, very quickly. Karjakin, knight here to f5, and this is an outpost that really stops this rook from doing too much more as far as getting behind enemy lines on this side of the board. Knight over here to b3 does not want to exchange off his knights right now. King to f7, recognizing needs to start to move over on the queen side, start to protect that a little bit. Knight to c5. So this is a much better square for this knight. Still holding down, putting pressure on this pawn on e6, but also stop some of the squares that the king here on the queen side of the board could start to get to, and also adding pressure on the pawn here on b7 as well. King back here to b8, rook over here to b1. So getting all that pressure over on the queen side of the board. King to a7. Rook to d3, just stopping if the knight's going to be coming here to d4. Doesn't want to have to worry about that at all. Rook here to c7. Rook over here to a3. Knight to d4 says, okay, now that the rook's not really holding down the fort here, I'm going to go ahead and bring my knight. But although this is a great square, very centrally located, it's kind of just playing by itself here. It can't really do too much. So after rook here to d1, the knight does come back. King up here to h3. Knight back here to h6, pawn to f3. So wants to stop some of these squares that the knight can come to. We are currently on move 51. They do get extra time after move 60. So a lot of times in this position, even before you get to 40, where they get a lot more time, you'll start to see slowly pieces moving around, trying to find a little edge here and there. But they like to get that extra time and then really start to think a little bit deeper in some of their moves. Rook here to f7, rook up here to d4, knight to f5, forcing the rook back here to d2. Rook to h7, rook here to b3, rook e7, rook here to d3, rook up here to h8, and then rook down here to b1. And this was the most critical time in this game so far, beyond that knight to f2, which Karjakin, could have had a draw here. But after rook to b1, we're in move 56. Both sides not really, at least on board, it looks like, doing anything too crazy. And Karjakin said in this moment, he said, hey, yeah, my opponent's just kind of been moving his rooks back and forth. It seemed like he was trying to get to move 60, which is only 4 moves from now. Said, I've been doing a pretty good job of defending these positions so far. I didn't think he was really up to anything when he played rook to e1. I thought it was somewhat innocent, to be honest. And he played rook to h7. Unfortunately for him, he said afterwards, I recognized as soon as he played pawn to b5, that I had made a huge mistake here on h7. He said, I didn't realize that rook to b1, he wanted to push right away, and that was kind of where he fell flat. Instead of the rook coming to h7, could have played rook over here to c8, trying to protect the queen side of the board. Instead, he played rook to h7, which really left his queen side of the board under attack that would be very difficult to hold on to. So pawn to b5, pawn recaptures rook to b5. It's interesting if when you heard from Magnus Carlsen at the press conference, he said, yeah, I was kind of planning that pawn to b5 for a long time at the end of the game. And so it's interesting to see how even before move 60, as they kind of maneuver pieces around, Magnus Carlsen was just waiting for that right opportunity to play pawn to b5 to try to break through over here on the queen side. And he has a lot of material on the queen side of the board where he can start to add a lot of pressure to his opponent. Definitely not a automatic win, but Magnus Carlsen has a huge advantage that he can start to really attack his opponent on board. In previous games that we've seen so far in this tournament, Magnus Carlsen's kind of squandered some opportunities, but recognizing that he no longer has that option here. If he squanders another opportunity, that could be the World Championship. So a pawn here to d3, a rook up here to b6, starting to put pressure on these pawns. Rook over here to c6, or c7, a knight up here to e6, rook down here, a knight down here to f4, rook over here to c6, and then knight to d5. I thought we actually may have seen, something different. Maybe the rook take on g6, and then if, the rook's going to take here, we could take back on d3. But decides to instead play a knight up here to d5, forking both the rooks. The rook's kind of forced to come here in exchange. Knight up here to c7, king to b8, knight down here to b5, attacking this pawn. King over here to c8, rook to g6. So some material comes off the board. Both sides have a pass pawn. Magnus Carlsen is up a pawn in material. The king is a little bit more exposed for Karjakin. So while the advantage is not huge, Magnus Carlsen definitely has a winning in-game in sight. So it's all about if he can actually turn this into a victory. So Carlsen continues with kings to g2. Attacking the rook. Rook comes over here to b3. Knight up here to c6. Attacking the king and the knight. Knight decides to go ahead. Yeah, I pretty much have to take it here. So rook here to d6, attacking the pawn. The rook comes over here to e5, attacking this pawn as well. It's kind of hard for both sides of the board to really hold on to material right here. And he could have even tried king to c7 instead of bringing his rook over here. After a rook to e3, a pawn up here to e6, king to c7. It's difficult because let's say pawn to d3. Then all of a sudden, king over here to f2, very difficult to hold on. Rook to e2, okay, fine. King up here to f3. And then what does black really do? If he pushes his pawn, then the rook's going to fall. So he's just going to have to play something like king here to c7, but then his pawn falls. So all in all, it's just kind of awkward for him. So decides to go ahead and not worry about pushing his own pawn. Decides to go and play king to c7 now. And the pawns are going to have to come off the board. Same thing as we talked about with Karjakin not being able to protect that pawn. Magnus Carlsen is not able to as well. But after these pawns come off the board, rook up here to d5, adding pressure on this pawn at h5. If he can go ahead and take this pawn off the board, 3 pawns to 1 with 2 passed pawns, it would be too much for Karjakin to overcome. Rook over here at h6, Magnus Carlsen says, okay, now's the time to get my king involved into the game, and starts to push it up a little bit. And Karjakin, after king to f6, resigns, recognizing that king to g7 is going to be too difficult to hold on to this material, and he will end up losing in an end game not too long from now. So Magnus Carlsen with a fantastic game. Got a little bit lucky that his opponent did not find that knight to f2. That would have been pretty epic fail, I think, on his part. But kudos to the champion for fighting back in Game 10, putting his opponent in some really tough spots and coming out with the victory. So for those who are kind of waiting for some fireworks, we went through the first 6 games with some pretty drawish games. Neither side really looking to break theory and do anything outside the norm. We're starting to see just that. We're starting to see some fireworks from both sides. So congratulations to Magnus Carlsen. The last 2 days are going to be pretty exciting with, we have a day off and then we have Karjakin playing the white pieces in game 12, the 28th of November. Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces. If they draw or they are equal in points after that, they will take a day off and then come back with tiebreakers on November 30th. That is Magnus Carlsen's birthday. It would be a nice birthday present to win the World Championship on there. But hopefully you guys are enjoying the tournament. Hopefully you enjoyed this game as well. One of the most exciting games, I think. Really exciting to see how Magnus Carlsen maneuvered and actually got out with the victory. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in game number 11.